It was a gray winter afternoon when Johnny Cash parked his black pickup truck in front of Hope Valley Nursing Home on the outskirts of Nashville. The smell of disinfectant and reheated food escaped through the open windows of the faded brick building. At that moment, Johnny Cash was at the peak of his career. His songs played on every radio station in the country. Millions of fans screamed his name in packed stadiums. He could have been anywhere in the world, living a life of luxury and glamour. But there he was, walking through the silent corridors of a nursing home that society had forgotten. His footsteps echoed on the worn linoleum as he passed rooms filled with lonely elderly residents, many having received no visitors for months. Cash wasn't there for publicity. There were no cameras, no journalists. Just a man seeking something his fame couldn't give him. The opportunity to make a difference in the life of someone the world had abandoned. At the end of the hallway, in a small, poorly lit room, lived Harold "Hal" Morrison, World War II veteran, 73 years old. No family, no visitors, no hope. Hal spent his days staring out the foggy window, reliving memories of a war that had ended decades ago, in a world that seemed to have completely forgotten his existence. Johnny Cash didn't know it yet, but he was about to meet a man whose story would change not only his own perspective on life, but transform that entire nursing home in a way no one could ever imagine. But nobody could imagine what he was about to discover in that forgotten room at the end of the corridor. Hope Valley Nursing Home was like so many others scattered across the country, a place where families left their elderly when they no longer knew what to do with them. The yellowed walls told stories of decades of neglect. Wallpaper peeled in the corners, and wheelchairs squeaked through the corridors like ghosts of lives that had once been vibrant. In room 23B, Harold Morrison spent his days in a silent and painful routine. At 73, Hal carried in his body the marks of a war that few still remembered. A deep scar cut across his face, a reminder of shrapnel from a grenade on the beaches of Normandy. His hands trembled constantly, not just from age, but from memories he could never erase. Hal had served as a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division. He parachuted into occupied France, fought house by house in the devastated streets of Europe, watched friends die in his arms. When he returned home in 1945, he was welcomed as a hero. Parades, medals, applause. The entire country celebrated its veterans. But years passed. The war became history. Heroes aged and were forgotten. Hal never married. The war had taken his fiancée, killed in a bombing in London while he fought in France. Without children, without close relatives, he ended up in that nursing home when his savings ran out and his health deteriorated. His only companions were other forgotten souls, Korean War veterans, elderly people without family, people society had simply decided to ignore. The head nurse, Margaret Thompson, had worked there for 15 years. She knew Hal was special. On nights when war nightmares woke him screaming, she comforted him. She knew every story he told, every medal kept in the drawer beside his bed. But Margaret also knew that Hal was giving up. Each day that passed, he spoke less, smiled less, hoped less. It was as if the war hero was dying slowly, not because of his body's wounds, but from the deepest wound of all, abandonment by a nation he had helped save. And it was exactly at this moment of silent despair that Johnny Cash crossed the threshold of that room. Hal Morrison had given up waiting. His last visit had been 8 months ago. A social worker who came to check his financial situation and left with a fake smile and empty promises. Since then, nothing. No letters, no phone calls, no living soul who cared whether he was still breathing. Hal's mornings always began the same way. He woke before dawn, not by choice, but because nightmares wouldn't let him sleep. The sound of bombardments still echoed in his ears. The scream of his best friend, Tommy, calling for help as he died in French mud, still haunted him. Hal would get up, look in the fogged bathroom mirror, and see a stranger, a broken man who had once been a brave soldier. His medals were stored in a small shoebox under the bed. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, medals that once meant honor and recognition. Now they were just cold metal that nobody cared to see. He had stopped showing them to new nursing home staff. Their look of indifference hurt more than any war wound. Margaret had noticed the changes. Hal stopped shaving regularly, stopped combing his hair. His meals came back untouched from the tray. When she tried to talk, he just shook his head and went back to staring out the window. It was as if he was preparing to leave, as if he had made a silent decision to simply disappear. What hurt Hal most was the bitterness. Not about the war he had chosen to fight. Not about the scars. They were invisible medals of his service. What destroyed him was the cruel irony of having risked everything to defend a country that now treated him like a burden. He had jumped from planes, faced Nazi tanks, carried wounded comrades for miles, all to protect American freedom and values. And where had it led him? To a 10-by-12-foot room, eating tasteless food, waiting for death to come while the world moved on without even remembering he existed. In his nightstand drawer, Hal kept a faded photograph. It was of himself in 1944, in uniform, smiling alongside Tommy and other soldiers before shipping out to France. In that photo, he was young, strong, full of purpose. He looked at that image every night and wondered where he had lost not just his youth, but his dignity, his relevance, his very identity. Hal Morrison, the war hero, had become Hal Morrison, the invisible man. And each day that passed, he became a little more transparent, a little closer to simply disappearing from the world that had already forgotten his existence. It was then that Johnny Cash made a decision that would change everything. Johnny Cash knocked gently on the half-open door of room 23B. "Sorry to bother you," he said with his deep, gentle voice. "May I come in?" Hal Morrison looked up, confused. It wasn't medication time, and Margaret had already checked to see if he was okay. When he saw the tall man dressed completely in black, with those penetrating but kind eyes, Hal didn't recognize him immediately. "Sure," Hal murmured, trying to straighten up in his chair. "Are you new here?" Cash smiled and sat in the only available chair in the room, a green plastic armchair that creaked. "Not exactly. My name is Johnny Cash. I came here because I wanted to meet some people who deserve to be known." Hal blinked a few times, processing the information. Johnny Cash? The Johnny Cash? There, in his room? Are you really? "I am," Cash replied without arrogance, just with the simplicity of someone accustomed to being recognized. "But more important than that, can you tell me a little about your story? Margaret told me you served in the war, and that's how it began." What should have been a quick courtesy visit turned into a 3-hour conversation. Hal, who for months had barely spoken a few words a day, suddenly found himself telling stories he had kept for decades. Cash didn't just listen. He asked questions, was interested in details, wanted to know about Tommy, about France, about what it was like to parachute in the middle of darkness. "Do you have medals?" Cash asked at one point. Embarrassed, Hal pointed under the bed. "They're there, but they're nothing important. May I see them?" With trembling hands, Hal pulled out the shoebox. One by one, Cash held each medal, read each citation, had Hal explain how he had earned them. The Purple Heart, for the time he was wounded saving 2 comrades. The Bronze Star, for the act of bravery that saved his entire unit. "Hal," Cash said, holding the Bronze Star up to the window light, "these medals represent more courage than I could have in 10 lifetimes. Tears began to flow down Hal's wrinkled face. It had been so long since anyone called him brave. So long since anyone looked at his medals with genuine admiration. When Cash finally stood to leave, he promised he would return. "Next week," he said, "I want to meet more veterans here, and I want you to help me get to know them." But during that first conversation, Cash had observed something that Hal didn't notice. The singer noticed that Hal mentioned several times that he dreamed of visiting Arlington Military Cemetery, where some of his comrades were buried. He noticed how the veteran's eyes lit up when talking about music, especially the patriotic songs he used to sing with the other soldiers. And Johnny Cash noticed something else. Hal Morrison wasn't just forgotten by the world. He had forgotten himself, his own worth, his own dignity. Leaving the nursing home, Cash sought out Margaret. "How many veterans do you have here?" he asked. 12, she replied. "Why?" Cash didn't answer immediately. His eyes were distant, as if he was calculating something, planning something. "Margaret," he finally said, "how would you feel if I organized a small performance here? Something just for the residents?" Margaret smiled. "They would be thrilled, Mr. Cash. But wouldn't that be too much trouble for you?" Johnny Cash looked back at the worn building, thinking about Hal Morrison and all the other forgotten heroes inside. "No," he said. "It's going to be exactly what I need to do." 2 weeks later, Johnny Cash returned to Hope Valley Nursing Home. But this time, he wasn't alone. Hal Morrison was wheeled in his wheelchair to the main hall, where all the residents had gathered. When he saw what Cash had prepared, his tears began to flow before the ceremony even started. Cash had brought a complete military band from Nashville Air Force Base. Soldiers in impeccable uniforms stood at attention beside a small, improvised stage. American flags decorated the hall. But what touched Hal most was what he saw in the center of the stage. 12 small pedestals, each with the name of a nursing home veteran engraved on golden plaques. "Gentlemen," Johnny Cash said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "Today I didn't come here as a singer. I came as an American who owes everything to you." One by one, Cash called each veteran to the stage. Margaret pushed Hal's chair as he trembled with emotion. When his turn came, Cash held his hands and spoke into the microphone. "Harold Morrison, Sergeant of the 101st Airborne Division, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, jumped into darkness over occupied France to give us the freedom we have today." The military band played a solemn version of Taps, while a young soldier placed a special medal on Hal's chest, a community recognition medal, approved by the base commander specifically for that ceremony. But the moment that broke everyone's hearts came when Cash approached the microphone with his guitar. "Hal told me you used to sing together in the war. How about we sing once more?" And then Johnny Cash began to play Battle Hymn of the Republic. His deep, emotional voice echoed through the hall, but was soon joined by other voices. Trembling voices, broken by age, but full of pride and memory. Hal sang louder than all of them, his voice finding a strength he thought he had lost forever. When the music ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. The nursing home staff were crying. The military band soldiers were visibly moved, and Hal Morrison, the man who had given up expecting anything from life, was standing, leaning on his cane, with his shoulders straight for the first time in years. Cash approached him and whispered something only Hal could hear. "Tomorrow, a helicopter from the base will take you to Arlington. Your comrades are waiting for your visit." Hal collapsed in tears, hugging Johnny Cash as if embracing a son who had returned from war. Hal Morrison's trip to Arlington lasted 3 days. He visited the graves of Tommy and other comrades, leaving flowers and telling stories he had kept for decades. When he returned to the nursing home, he was a different man. His eyes sparkled again. He shaved every day, wore his military shirt on Sundays. But the impact went beyond Hal. Johnny Cash's ceremony awakened the Nashville community. Donations began arriving at the nursing home. Volunteers offered to visit residents. Local schools adopted the veterans, bringing children to hear their stories. Margaret Thompson saw a complete transformation at Hope Valley Nursing Home. The forgotten place became a center of honor and memory. And Hal Morrison, the man who had given up on living, became the spokesperson for forgotten veterans, telling his story in schools and community events until his final days, 5 years later. Johnny Cash continued visiting the nursing home monthly until his own death. The story of Johnny Cash and Harold Morrison teaches us that true greatness isn't found on stages or success charts. It's in the quiet moments when we choose to see dignity where others see only abandonment. A gesture of compassion can rewrite someone's story ending, transform forgotten lives into legacies of hope. Johnny Cash's journey reminds us that the true measure of a man lies in how he treats those society has forgotten. If this story of redemption touched you, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs a little hope. What other act of kindness do you know that deserves to be told? Leave your story in the comments.